Hello and welcome to another gentle descent into the past tonight. We'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I am honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more. The medieval mind approached lore differently than we do, where we seek consistency and precedent. They often relied on tradition, divine, to uncover together today. Judgment and what we might charitably call creative problem-solving laws were not merely rules to be followed, but reflections of deeply held beliefs about morality, social order, and the very of truth itself. Consider the peculiar case of animal trials, a legal tradition that flourished nature across medieval Europe for several centuries. Yes, you heard correctly, animals could be put on trial, complete with legal representation, formal proceedings, and even appeals. In 1386, a pig in France was tried were not mere and executed for killing an infant. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, as if to emphasize its moral culpability. This was not an that killed Trojan bulls that isolated incident, but part of a broader legal framework that held animals accountable for their actions in ways that seem almost fantastical to us. Now, these animal trials curiosities but reflected deep-seated beliefs about justice and moral order. Medieval people believed that all of creation was bound by divine law, and when that law was broken, even by a beast, justice demanded satisfaction. Pigs, defendants in formal legal proceedings, gored farmers, and even insects that destroyed crops could find themselves that had rung during violent storms were sometimes put on trial. For the legal representation provided to these animal defendants was often surprisingly thorough. In 1750, a female donkey was tried for bestiality alongside her human accomplice in France. The donkey's defense attorney argued successfully that she had been an unwilling participant, and she was acquitted while the man was executed. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's good character and previous virtuous behavior. But animals were not the only unexpected defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects, too, could find themselves on trial. If a sword killed someone, the weapon itself might be tried and banished from the realm. Bells, their role in summoning destructive weather trees that had fallen and killed passers-by, could be formally prosecuted and sentenced to be cut down and removed. These object trials reflected a world view where the boundaries between the animate and inanimate, the moral and amoral, were far more fluid than our modern understanding would suggest. Every element of creation was seen as part of a grand moral order, and when that order was disrupted, the law stepped in to restore balance. The concept of trial by ordeal added another layer of strangeness to medieval justice. These were legal procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The underlying belief was that God would be required to carry and not allow an innocent person to suffer harm during these tests, making them a form of supernatural lie detector. Trial by hot iron was one such ordeal. The accused, or poor healing guilt, was assumed of piece of red-hot iron for a specified distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. It showed signs of infection. Trial by cold water involved throwing the accused into a body of water while bound. If they floated, most dramatically, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled, considered guilty as the pure water was rejecting them. If they sank and drowned fighting each other, or they could hire champions, they were posthumously declared innocent. This presented what we might call also produced some significant design flaw in the justice system, as innocence could only be proven through death, perhaps through physical battle. This could involve the actual disputants, and could only enter the town to perform, and were goods. Interestingly, executioners often supplemented to fight on their behalf. The belief was that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. Interestingly, this practice was not limited to men, women, clergy, and the healer. Their intimate knowledge of anatomy, elderly, could all demand trial by combat, though they typically employed champions rather than fighting personally. The legal status of various professions in medieval Europe. Wonderfully strange laws. Executioners, for instance, occupied a peculiar position in society. While their services were essential for the functioning of the justice system, they were often considered ritually unclean. While crying out their shame to all who passed was designed both as punishment and as a way to encourage charitable contributions from Bologna, if they had been present when the debt was incurred. This led to the subjected to numerous restrictions in many German states. Executioners were required to live outside town walls in ways that seemed their duties. They were forbidden from touching food in markets, as their touch was believed to contaminate income by working gained through their primary profession, them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. This created the paradoxical situation where the same person might take a life. The punishment for selling bad food was often poetic justice taken to extremes. In the morning and save one in the afternoon. The legal treatment of debt in medieval Europe produced some particularly inventive solutions in parts of medieval France. A debtor who could not pay might be required to sit naked in the town square. This public humiliation passes by some regions, developed the concept of debt inheritance. Almost surreal today in certain parts of medieval Germany, unpaid debts could be inherited by the debtor, as children's strange practice of excluding children from important financial discussions to protect them from future liability. The regulation of markets and trade produced its own category of unusual laws in medieval London. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf hung around their necks. Also led to some fascinating there. Ale could be forced to drink only their own inferior product for a specified period. The medieval understanding it belonged to legal concepts. The doctrine of treasure trove held that any valuable object found buried in the ground belonged to the crown, based on the assumption that it had been hidden with the intention of retrieval. However, if the treasure was found above ground in a world very finder, leading to complex legal debates about exactly what constituted buried versus merely hidden, these strange laws were not merely the products of backward thinking or primitive legal understanding. They reflected sophisticated attempts to maintain social order. What seemed bizarre to us, made perfect, different from our own medieval society, faced challenges. We can barely imagine constant warfare, devastating plagues, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of famine. In such a world, laws needed to be more than mere rules. They needed to be mechanisms for preserving the delicate balance that kept communities together. The apparent strangeness of these laws often dissolves when we understand the context in which they operated. Since two people living in a world where divine judgment was a daily reality, where community harmony was essential for survival, and where justice needed to be both seen and felt by all members of society. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, we begin to see that these strange laws were threads in a complex tapestry of belief, tradition, and practical. We will delve deeper into the curious world of and our place in the grand scheme of necessity. They tell us not just about legal systems, but about entire ways of understanding the world, human nature, creation, and our next exploration in European history. But for now, let the strange and medieval marriage laws, where love, politics, and legal ingenuity combine to create some of the most fascinating and bewildering regulations. Wonderful world of medieval justice, settle gently in your mind as you drift toward peaceful sleep. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts when it came to food. While kings and nobles feasted on elaborate banquets with exotic spices and multiple courses, the vast majority of people lived on the edge of starvation, their meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel. This disparity wasn't merely about wealth, it was a reflection of an entire social system built on inequality. For the common peasant, meat was an extraordinary luxury. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these animals were far too valuable to slaughter regularly. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and the occasional offspring that could be sold for much-needed coin. When meat did appear on the peasant table, it was usually during religious festivals, or when an animal was too old or sick to serve any other purpose. Even then, every scrap was used from organ meats to blood puddings, as nothing could be wasted. In a world where the next meal was never guaranteed, the preservation of food presented another monumental challenge. Fermentation to keep their food from spoiling. Salt itself was expensive and often of poor quality, filled with impurities that could make preserved meats taste terrible or even cause illness. Fish were packed in barrels with heavy salt, creating a product that bore little resemblance to fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into leathery strips that could last through the winter months. But perhaps the most insidious problem was the widespread adulteration of food. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers, driven by poverty and desperation, cut corners to maximize their profits. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was often stretched with sawdust, chalk, ground acorns, or even bone meal. These additives not only made the bread less nutritious, but could also be dangerous to consume. Similarly, ale and wine were frequently watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unpalatable drinks. that provided little refreshment or nutrition. The story of Agnes, a fictional but representative alewife, illustrates these challenges. Perfectly struggling to support her family after her husband's death, Agnes found herself faced with rising grain prices, dwindling customers desperate to make her ale last longer and increase her profits. She began watering down her brew. At first, the deception went unnoticed, but word soon spread about the weak, tasteless ale. Her once loyal customers began seeking other establishments, and Agnes' reputation was ruined. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, leaving her family in even more desperate circumstances. The authorities did attempt to regulate food quality through laws, like the Assay of Bread and Ale, which set standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators could face fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or even corporal punishment. In some cases, dishonest bakers were dragged through the streets with their substandard loaves hung around their necks as a warning to others. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and that drove people to adulterate their products, remained often ineffective as the underlying economic pressures unchanged. The lack of variety in the medieval diet was another source of suffering. While today can enjoy fruits and vegetables from around the world, year-round medieval people were entirely dependent, made from barley, oats, or rye, on what could be grown locally and what was in season for most of the year were among the hardiest crops. But these provided little. Peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of porridge, accompanied by whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. Times by onions, leeks, and cabbages in the way of essential vitamins and minerals. The seasonal nature of food availability meant that late winter and early spring were particularly difficult, than the previous year's harvest would be running low and the new crops had not yet matured. This period, known as the Hunger Gap, was when malnutrition was most severe. Death rates highest. Children born during these lean months often suffered from stunted growth and agents, but symbols of status and power displayed as weakened immune systems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Spices, which we now take for granted along dangerous and power tables, groaned under the weight of precious commodities in medieval Europe. Pepper, cinnamon were among the most. While servants paraded dishes through the hall with great cloves, and nutmeg had to be transported over vast distances, trade routes making them extraordinarily expensive. A pound of nutmeg, in the 11th attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, serves as a reminder. In the century, could cost as much as 7 oxen, putting it far beyond the reach of ordinary people. Anabian indulged in what he thought was a harmless treat for the wealthy. Spices were not just flavoring prominently as jewels or fine clothing. The contrast between rich and poor was perhaps nowhere more evident than in the royal feast. These elaborate affairs were designed not just to feed the nobility, but to demonstrate their wealth. Roasted peacocks, swans, and other exotic birds, their feathers carefully replaced after cooking to create stunning visual displays. Sugar sculptures called depicted scenes from mythology or heraldic symbols. Ceremony. Even these magnificent feasts came with their own dangers. Without understanding of food safety, even the wealthy were vulnerable to food poisoning and other ailments. The death of King John of England in 1216. Medieval world, every meal was potentially hazardous. The king had been traveling through the countryside when he stopped it. Within days he was dead from what modern historians believe was severe food poisoning. The unsanitary conditions of medieval life compounded these food safety issues. Peasant families often shared their single-room dwellings with their livestock, as the animals provided warmth during the cold winter months. However, this arrangement meant that animal waste, insects, and vermin were constant presences in the home. Food was prepared and consumed in these same spaces, with contamination almost inevitable in medieval cities. The situation was even worse. Narrow, winding streets were filled with garbage, human and industries. The lack of proper sewage systems meant waste, and the refuse from various trades. That waste often contaminated water sources, making even drinking water dangerous. The Thames Palms in London, for example, served simultaneously as the city's primary water source and its main sewer of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. The Catholic Church, a situation that contributed to frequent outbreaks to medieval food culture through its extensive fasting requirements, added another layer of complexity. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs. For the wealthy, this meant substituting fish and other alternatives, but for the poor it often meant simply going without. Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays were also designated as meatless days throughout the year, further restricting an already limited diet. While the Church's intentions may have been spiritual, the practical effect of these restrictions was often too worsen the nutritional status of people who were already malnourished. The story of John and Matilda, a fictional peasant couple, illustrates this dilemma. John, a devout man, wrestled with his faith as he watched his family suffer. She would make, when the fast finally ended, not all of the church's with 3 children to feed and only a small plot of land. They struggled too in the best of times during Lent. They were expected to give pioneered new techniques in crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry, provide adequate nutrition, even up the small amounts of preserved meat and dairy, provided crucial protein and calories. As the days wore on, their children grew weak and listless, crying constantly from hunger, while Matilda secretly dreamed of the hearty stew. Influence on food was negative, however. Monasteries and abbeys with their produced high-quality bread. Extensive landholdings and well-organized communities often served as centers of agricultural innovation that gradually improved food production. They also served as sources of charity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, distributing bread and ale to the hungry and providing shelter for travelers and pilgrims. The story of Saint Hildegard of Bingen exemplifies the positive aspects of the Church's relationship with food. Born into a noble family in 12th century Germany, Hildegard became an abbess. Was renowned for her knowledge of herbal medicine and nutrition. She wrote extensively about the properties of different grains and foods, advocating for spelt as a healthier alternative to common wheat. Under her guidance, the nuns at her abbey that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Hildegard's holistic approach to nutrition, which emphasized the connection between food and health, was remarkably prescient and would not be fully appreciated until modern times. Represents perhaps the darkest chapter in medieval food history. A catastrophic combination of climate change, crop failures, and political instability plunged much of Europe into 7 years of starvation and misery. Contemporary chronicles paint a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people. The Flemish chronicler William of Nongus wrote that men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, while other accounts describe people resorting to cannibalism in their desperation. The famine hit different regions with varying severity, but nowhere was spared entirely. In some areas of the Low Countries in Scandinavia, mortality rates reached 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt saw an average of 16 deaths per day during the worst years, compared to just a per day in normal times. The psychological impact of the famine was as devastating as the physical toll, creating a generation scarred spell memory of extreme hunger and loss. Even in normal times, the threat of food and social structures people developed, and peasant families lived in constant fear of the next crisis. Scarcity was never far away. A single failed harvest could disaster for entire communities. Knowledge of wild plants and alternative food sources. The contrast between medieval food culture, this precarious existence, shaped every aspect of medieval life, from marriage and family planning to religious beliefs. Elaborate strategies for coping with scarcity, from complex systems of mutual aid to detailed, and our modern abundance is striking today. We can walk into a supermarket, find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and vegetables from around the world, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We have access to a variety of foods that would have been unimaginable to even the wealthiest medieval nobles. We grapple with issues of food waste, environmental sustainability that provides us with an adulteration. People found ways to survive, and even understanding of nutrition, food safety, and preservation has transformed eating that is still used today from a daily struggle into a source of pleasure and nourishment, and the privileges we enjoy. Yet this abundance comes with its own challenges and sharing that continue to shape our culture as we reflect on this, and dietary-related health problems that were unknown in the medieval world. The global food system's such variety also creates new forms of inequality and environmental degradation. A refrigerator or visiting a grocery store represents. There are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors about the value of local seasonal eating and the that once dictated importance of not taking food for granted. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of enormous challenges. Despite the constant threats of hunger, disease, create moments of joy and celebration around food. They developed preservation techniques, created dishes that evolved into modern cuisines, and established traditions of hospitality. distant past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress we have made, the simple act of opening centuries of advancement in agriculture, technology, and social organization at the same time. The medieval experience reminds us of our fundamental dependence on food and the importance of ensuring that everyone has access to adequate nutrition. The legacy of medieval food culture lives on in many ways, but affirmations of traditional preservation methods like smoking and fermentation have experienced a renaissance among modern cooks, seeking authentic flavors and sustainable practices. The seasonal rhythms. Medieval diets are being rediscovered by those promoting local and sustainable agriculture. Even the elaborate feasts of the nobility have their modern counterparts in the fine dining establishments that turn meals into theatrical experiences. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience teaches us about the deep connections between food, community, and survival. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, sharing food became one of the most fundamental expressions of human compassion and solidarity. The communal meals that marked religious festivals and life transitions were not just celebrations, social bonds, and mutual support. As we drift off to sleep in our modern world of abundance, we can remember the countless generations who struggled to fill their bellies with whatever meager sustenance they could find. Their perseverance in the face of such hardship reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of gratitude for the simple blessings we often take for granted. In honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to building a world where no one need suffer the pangs of hunger that define so much of human history. As the candlelit shadows danced across the stone walls of medieval castles, a stark defined the era while nobles feasted on exotic that would horrify modern sensibilities, delicacies, and sumptuous banquets. The vast majority of medieval Europeans faced a daily struggle for sustenance. They could find garlic, mustard, and vinegar became the scarcity of spices, created one of the most glaring differences between rich and poor. While a pound of nutmeg in the 11th century cost as much as 7 fattened oxen, peasants made do with leaving most stew and whatever hardy vegetables could survive the harsh climate. Whatever meager seasonings, their primary weapons against the relentless blandness of their daily fare. The absence of reliable preservation methods meant fresh produce remained seasonal luxuries. Subsist on monotonous grains at meat consumption revealed perhaps the starkest inequality. A prosperous peasant family might slaughter their pig, but even this was passed on, brought before a memorial court in 1322, for stealing only once a year, usually at Christmas, while nobles gorged themselves on. Illustrates the cruel irony of we know today elaborate dishes featuring exotic game when meat did grace the peasant table often came in forms that would turn modern stomachs: organ meats, blood puddings, and cuts from animals too old or sick for other purposes. Fish offered some relief for those near water sources, typically preserved through heavy salting, creating a far cry from the delicate preparation. The Church's influence permeated every aspect of medieval food culture often, but enforcement remained sporadic at best, unsanitary conditions compounding the hardships faced by the poor. Lent's 40 fast meant giving up what little meat and dairy peasants possessed, while wealthy nobles could afford exotic substitutes. The story of Agnes spread during Lent to feed her starving children. That contaminated food could fell rulers. Religious dietary restrictions imposed on those already living at the edge of starvation. Adulteration ran rampant in an era without regulations or quality control. Unscrupulous bakers stretched their precious flour with sawdust, chalk, or ground acorns, creating dense, gritty loaves that provided little nutrition. Alewives watered down their brews. 7 years of crop failures plunged Europe, increased profits, leaving customers with weak, unsatisfying drinks that barely qualified as beverages. The assay of bread and ale attempted to regulate these practices, made every meal a potential hazard. Peasant families shared their cramped quarters with livestock, creating breeding grounds for disease and contamination. Animal waste mingled with food preparation areas, while flies and vermin spread filth throughout living spaces. Even kings weren't immune. King John of England's death in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peachust, demonstrated as easily as peasants. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 revealed the precarious nature of medieval food security into starvation, so severe that chroniclers reported cannibalism and people eating grass, bark, and even their own children. Mortality rates reached 25%. In some regions, with cities like Earth averaging 16 deaths per day, compared to 2 in normal times. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people revealed the precarious nature of medieval food security. 7 years of crop failures plunged Europe into starvation so severe that chroniclers reported cannibalism and people eating grass bark, and even their own children. Mortality rates reached 25% in some regions, with cities like Earth averaging 16 deaths per day compared to 2 in normal times. Despite these overwhelming challenges, demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques through salting, smoking, and fermentation. Women, who bore primary responsibility for feeding their family, created folk traditions of pickling and foraging that sustained communities. Through lean times, monasteries served as centers of agricultural innovation and charitable food distribution, offering some relief to the desperate. The rare medieval feast provided a stunning contrast to daily reality of royal banquets. Featured dozens of elaborate dishes, roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and delicacies. Flavored with precious spices, these displays of culinary opulence served not just as, and the struggling mass, perhaps most remarkably medieval people, entertainment, but as powerful demonstrations of wealth and status, reminding all present of the vast gulf between the privileged few. Found ways to create meaning and community around food despite its scarcity. Harvest festivals brought together in celebration of successful crops, became an opportunity for families to gather around the hearth telling stories. And the legacy of medieval food culture and resilience in an age where we can access flavors. Wedding feasts, however modest, marked life's milestones with shared meals, even the humblest maintaining bonds that sustained them through hardship, reminds us of both human vulnerability we now enjoy, teaching us never to take for granted the basic human right to from around the globe with unprecedented ease and safety. It's worth remembering. Might know abundance were those who found joy and sustenance in the simplest of meals. Their struggles and ingenuity laid the foundations for the abundance while exploring the harsh realities of medieval European law, nourishment, and the profound satisfaction of sharing food with those we love. As we drift off to sleep with full bellies and endless choices at our fingertips, we can honor their memory. To the whims of weather and war, where even the most basic human needs were fraught with difficulty and danger, appreciating the remarkable journey that brought us from medieval scarcity to modern plenty. In every bite we take, we taste the hard-won progress of countless generations who transform necessity into the art of cuisine, ensuring that future generations of a guilty verdict could mean the loss of a hand, an eye, or even his life. This was not a world of careful, they knew only one. Looking at your reference videos and existing script, I'll continue from where part 3 left off, maintaining this sleep-inducing tone. The legal systems that governed medieval Europe were designed not so much to determine guilt and society as we've seen the world of medieval that kept peasants in there, but one where justice was swift, harsh, and stands before he worked in return. The Lord was expected to provide protection. Europe was one, food was scarce, often contaminated and subject. In the great hall of his manor where he would sit in judgment over disputes, dealt with a bewildering array of offenses, but perhaps even more challenging than securing one's next meal was navigating the complex and often brutal system of justice that governed daily life. The laws of medieval Europe were a patchwork of traditions, customs, and edicts that varied dramatically from one region to another, creating a landscape where justice was anything but certain. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval courthouse, imagine the tension as an accused thief panel of judges. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best, yet consequences, deliberation, and reasoned argument, often arbitrary, in a sense, but to maintain order through fear and to reinforce the rigid social hierarchies place and nobles in power. The foundation of medieval law rested upon a complex web of feudal obligations and customary practices, had evolved over centuries. At the heart of this system was the concept of personal loyalty and mutual obligation between lord and vassal. A peasant owed service to his lord not merely as a tenant but as a bound serf whose very existence was tied to the land. And just as though these protections were often more theoretical than real, the lord escort was typically held between his tenants. Crimes committed within his domain and violations of the countless regulations that governed peasant life. These memorial courts, from the trivial to the serious, a peasant might find himself hauled before his lord for allowing his pigs to wander into a neighbor's garden, for failing to attend the required number of days of labor service, or for the serious crime of attempting to leave the manor without permission. The punishments were often brutal, disproportionate to the crimes. A serf caught trying to flee might be branded on the forehead with a hot iron, marking him forever as a runaway. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to walk naked through the village, well-being and reinforcing the authority of those in power pelted with stones and filth by her neighbors. The concept of individual rights, as we understand them today, was virtually non-existent in medieval legal thinking. Justice was not about protecting the innocent or ensuring fair treatment, but about maintaining social order. The idea that all people might be equal before the law would have been laughable to a medieval lord who saw himself as inherently superior to the peasants who worked his land. The law existed to serve the interests of the ruling class, and any benefits that might trickle down to the common people were incidental at best. Perhaps nowhere was this inequality more apparent than in the realm of criminal justice. When a crime was committed, the response of the authorities depended heavily on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. If a peasant stole a loaf of bread from a nobleman's table, he might face hanging or mutilation. He might escape with nothing, but if a nobleman killed a peasant in a fit of rage, was more than a fine paid to the victim. As family, the wealthy could often purchase their way out of legal troubles. Through gave rise to some of the most bizarre and brutal practices in the history of law procedures that seemed bribes, political connections, or by claiming benefit of clergy, a legal loophole that allowed those who could read Latin to be tried in ecclesiastical rather than secular courts, where the guilt of the wicked punishments were typically less severe. The process of determining guilt, innocence in medieval courts often bore little resemblance to modern concepts of justice. Evidence, as we understand it today, rarely considered decisive. Instead, medieval justice relied heavily on supernatural intervention and divine judgment to reveal the truth. Belief in divine justice, almost incomprehensible to modern minds, but were accepted as perfectly reasonable by medieval people, believed that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly. Trial by ordeal was one such practice, based on the assumption that divine intervention would protect the innocent while revealing. There were several forms of ordeal, each more harrowing than the last. In the ordeal of hot iron, the accused would be required to carry a red-hot piece of metal for a prescribed distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or festering, they were judged required the guilty and punished accordingly. The ordeal of hot water, the hand after 3 days, would determine their fate. For those accused, typically a pond or which operated accused to plunge their hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring. As with the hot iron, the had accepted condition of particularly serious crimes, there was the ordeal of cold water. On the opposite principle, the accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water. River had been blessed by a priest. If they sank, they were considered innocent as the pure water of them. If they floated, they were deemed guilty as the water had rejected their corrupted soul. Either way, the accused faced a grim prospect: drowning if innocent, or surviving only to face execution. Guilty. The logic of this system was based on medieval understanding of the natural, with priests presiding over the world where it was believed that water, being pure and holy, would naturally reject anything evil or corrupted. These orals were not administered and blessing the instruments of trial. The accused would typically be lightly, without ceremony. They were elaborate rituals that often took place in churches or other sacred spaces for the actual procedure before facing proceedings to the party in the right, ensuring that justice through armed conflict between the parties involved. This practice was based on the belief required to fast for several days beforehand, and to attend special masuds to purify their soul. Divine judgment. The entire community would often gather to witness these spectacles, which served not only as a means of determining guilt, but as powerful demonstrations of divine power and earthly authority. Psychological impact of these. The combatants would fight with weapons cannot be overstated. Many accused individuals, believing themselves to be guilty or convinced that God would reveal their sins, would confess before undergoing the ordeal. Terrified by the prospect of divine judgment, would flee before the appointed day, an act that was taken as clear evidence of guilt in some cases. The mere threat of trial by ordeal was enough to extract a confession or to resolve a dispute without the need. But perhaps even more telling about medieval attitudes toward justice was the practice of trial by combat, where disputes were resolved. That God would grant victory would prevail through strength of arms. Trial by combat could be invoked for a wide range of disputes, from accusations of treason and murder to disagreements over property rights and commercial contracts. Appropriate to their social status, nobles might use swords and shields, while commoners might be armed with clubs or staffs. The rules governing trial by combat were surprisingly elaborate and formal. The fight would take place in a designated area, often a field outside the town walls, with strict boundaries. marked out to prevent either combatant from fleeing officials, would oversee the proceedings to ensure that the combat was conducted fairly, though what constituted fairness in a system based on mortal combat was itself questionable. The fight would continue until one party was killed, severely wounded, or surrendered. By crying out for mercy, victory was taken as clear evidence of divine favor and thus of the righteousness of the winners, who made their living by serving as champions in legal disputes for those unable to fight for themselves due to age, disability, or gender. The wealthy could hire the best champions, while the poor were left to find whatever representation the system allowed for the appointment of champions who would fight on their behalf. This created a class of who might not be entirely committed to their cause. In some cases, women were who would fight for whoever could afford their services. Regardless of the merits of professional fighters, these men were often skilled warriors. Of the case to determine justice, they could appoint male champions to fight. For them, the tool of punishments available to medieval judges was vast and creative in its cruelty, reflecting a society that viewed physical suffering as an appropriate response to moral transgression, both severe and public, serving as deterrence to others who might be tempted to break the law. The principle of retribution rather than rehabilitation and punishments could afford or to fight for themselves against potentially superior opponents. Women, being generally barred from combat, faced particular challenges in a system that relied so heavily on physical prowess, but this put them at the mercy of men allowed to fight against male accusers, but under conditions that were heavily stacked. Against them, a woman accused of killing her husband, for example, might be required to fight up to her waist with one arm tied behind her back, while standing in a pit. Her male opponent fought with full mobility and weaponry. The brutality of these legal procedures extended beyond the courtroom to the punishments that were meted out to those found guilty. Medieval justice was based on designed range. Saw physical suffering as an appropriate response to moral transgression. For theft, one of the most common crimes in an age of widespread poverty, the punishments varied according to the value of the stolen goods and the social status of the thief. A peasant caught stealing food might lose a hand, making it impossible for him to work and essentially condemning him to death by starvation. A repeat offender might face hanging, while someone caught stealing from a church could be sentenced to having their eyes put out or their tongue cut off. The logic behind these punishments was that the penalty should reflect the tongue that had spoken falsehoods, and so on. Public executions were elaborate. Nature of the crime: a thief lost the hand that had committed the theft, a liar lost spectacles that drew crowds from miles around, combining entertainment with moral instruction in a way that seems grotesque to modern sensibilities. The condemned would be paraded through the streets to the place of execution, often accompanied by priests who would, or the social status of the condemned, exhort them to confess their sins and prepare for the afterlife. The methods of execution varied widely and were often chosen to reflect the however medieval justice demanded punishments that went far beyond simple severity of the crime. Nobles might be granted the privilege of beheading, considered a quick and honorable death, while commoners faced hanging, which was seen as more degrading but equally final for the most serious. Drawn and quartered, a process that began with the crime's death. Traitors might be hanged, condemned, being dragged through the streets on a hurdle, then hanged until nearly dead, while still alive, and finally cut into quarters that would be displayed in prominent locations as a warning to others. Heretics and witches faced burning at the stake, a punishment that was believed to purify their souls through fire, while serving as a dramatic demonstration of the fate that awaited those who defied religious authority. Crimes faced punishments: who killed a husband might be burned alive, as this crime was seen as a form of treason against the natural that reflected medieval attitudes toward gender and morality. A woman order that placed husbands in authority over their wives, prostitute, might be forced to wear distinctive clothing or as marks of shame, while women accused of being scolds or shrews might be subjected to have their heads shaved to mend their ways. The ducking stool strapped to a chair and repeatedly dunked in a pond or river until they promised for a prescribed period. Wealthy defendants could often negotiate. The application of these punishments was far from consistent, however, and the wealthy and well-connected often found ways to escape the full force of medieval justice. Benefit of clergy allowed those who, where they could remain safe from secular, could demonstrate literacy to claim the right to be tried in church courts, where punishments were typically less severe. Sanctuary laws permitted criminals to claim protection in churches by demonstrating the power of the authorities and the consequences that vastly outnumbered their rulers and had little authorities. Monetary payments that would substitute for physical punishment or they could simply flee to other jurisdictions where their crimes were unknown. The legal systems of medieval Europe also reflected this system of justice. Brutal and arbitrary as it was, served important functions in medieval society beyond simply punishing wrongdoers. Influenced the development of legal systems in many parts of Europe. Germanic tribal laws, and gradually codified, governed many aspects. Public punishments reinforced social hierarchies of challenging established order. They provided a form of entertainment in another marriage customs. Property rights world where diversions were few and far between. Most importantly, they created a climate of fear that helped to maintain control over a population to lose by rebellion. Fragmented nature of political authority during this period. A person traveling from one region to but through its influence on another might find themselves subject to completely different laws and customs who could read and write as an excuse for transgression. The church played a particularly important role in medieval, creating a confusing patchwork of jurisdictions and legal traditions. Canon law derived from church teachings and papal governed matters relating to marriage, morality, and the authority of the church. Blasphemy, heresy, and failure to attend religious observance. Roman law preserved in the legal codes of the ancient empire, passed down through oral tradition of daily life in regions that had been settled by barbarian tribes. Local customs and traditions added another layer of complexity to this legal maze. What was considered a crime in one village might be perfectly acceptable in, and commercial practices all varied from place to place, creating endless opportunities for confusion and conflict. A merchant traveling from town to town had to be familiar with the specific laws and customs of each place he visited, as ignorance of local law was rarely accepted. Legal systems, not only through its own canon law, secular courts, and its provision of educated clerks' legal documents. Many medieval laws were designed to enforce Christian morality and to support mass were serious crimes that could result in severe punishment. The church's extensive landholdings and its role as a major economic and political power meant that ecclesiastical courts often had jurisdiction over matters that would be considered purely secular today. As we consider these harsh realities of medieval justice, it becomes clear that the legal systems of this period, shaped by fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, divine will, and social order than those that govern modern societies. The idea that justice should be impartial, that punishment should fit the crime, or that all people should be equal before the law, were foreign concepts in a world where social hierarchy was seen as divinely ordained, and where the primary purpose of law was to maintain order rather than to protect individual rights. The legacy of these medieval legal systems can still be seen in many aspects of modern law, from the adversarial nature of court proceedings to the use of juries to determine guilt or innocence, marked by countless struggles for reform and recognition. But the evolution from the brutal and arbitrary justice of the Middle Ages to the more humane and rational legal systems of today has been a long and gradual process. These were the foundations upon which our modern world was built. Human dignity. As we drift deeper into sleep, let these images of medieval justice fade into the background of our consciousness, the harsh realities of life in an age where might made right, where divine judgment of our medieval ancestors were real and often brutal. They also laid the ideas of human rights, due process, and equal was not in vain, for it taught humanity hard lessons about the importance of fairness. Compassion was sought through trial by fire and water, and where public executions served as both entertainment and moral instruction under law that we now take for granted. Rest easy knowing that while the dark soil from which justice struggles that were no less dire for being mundane. Consider the plight of Hamish Malauda working a small strip of land on the estates of his clan chief, each groundwork for the more just and humane societies we inhabit today. Their suffering, the rule of law, and in their stories of endurance in the face of arbitrary power was perpetually damped from the highland mists and cruel justice. We find inspiration for our own ongoing efforts to create a world where all people can live with dignity and hope. Word count 1847. The life of a peasant in medieval Scotland was marked by the constant struggle against both human oppression and the unforgiving forces of nature. While clan warfare raged overhead and a good harvest might see the family through the winter months, but a poor one, English armies periodically swept across the border. The common folk faced their own daily battles. Cofter. Morning before dawn, he would wake to the sound of his wife Margaret grinding oats for the day's porridge, the rhythmic scraping of stone against stone, a familiar soundtrack to their existence. Their single room dwelling shared with a cow and several chickens for warmth that seemed to seep through every crack in the stone walls. The soil Hamish worked was thin, rocky, grudgingly yielding crops of oats and barley that formed the backbone of their diet. Meant watching their children's faces grow gaunt with hunger as the stores dwindled. The specter of famine was never far away, and when it struck, entire communities could be reduced to eating grass, bark, and whatever roots they could dig from the frozen ground. In times of relative plenty, the quality of food available to peasants like Hamish was poor by any standard. Bread was often made from inferior grains, mixed with whatever fillers could be found, ground acorns, peas, or even sawdust. When times perhaps a bit of were particularly desperate, the resulting loaves were dense, gritty affairs that could break teeth and provide a little nourishment. Meat was a rare luxury, salted pork at Christmas or when an animal died of natural causes, and moisture, yet storage facilities where preparation and storage of food presented constant challenges in an age without refrigeration or proper preservation techniques. Grain had to be carefully protected from rats. Primitive at best, milk soured quickly, meat spoiled rapidly in warm weather, and even ale, the common drink of choice since water sources were often contaminated, could turn rancid if not consumed promptly. The very act of eating was fraught with danger in ways that would be unimaginable. Of contamination was rampant, with livestock often kept in the same spaces where food was prepared and consumed. Flies buzzed constantly between animal waste and cooking pots, while vermin scurried through grain stores and kitchen areas. Food poisoning was common, and even nobles were not immune. King England himself died in 1216 after consuming spoiled peaches, adding to fish must be put away in observance of church law. These hardships were the religious restrictions imposed by the Catholic Church during Lent and on designated fast days throughout the year. Even the meager protein sources available to peasants were forbidden for families' calories they desperately needed, already subsisting on the edge of starvation. These additional dietary restrictions could push them over their few precious eggs and strips of brink. Margaret Mallowd would watch helplessly as her children grew weaker during the 40 days of Lent, knowing dried. The unscrupulous practices of food producers added another layer of misery to peasant life. Bakers regularly adulterated their bread with sawdust, chalk, or ground bones to stretch their supplies. Alewives watered down their brews to increase profits, leaving their customers with weak, unsatisfied drinks that provided little of the nutrition. While laws existed to prevent such practices, enforcement was sporadic and often ineffective. Perhaps most tragic was the stark inequality that defined medieval Scottish society. While peasants like Hamish and Margaret scraped together meals of thin porridge and stale bread, the wholes of their clan chiefs groaned under the weight of elaborate feasts, roasted meats, exotic spices, fine wines. A peasant family might see in a month. This disparity was not merely about quantity, but about the varied and delicate pastries graced the tables of the nobility, who consumed more in a single meal than into the wealthy enjoyed varied diets rich in proteins. Nature of the food itself, where peasants ate coarse, monotonous fare that left them malnourished, susceptible to disease. Fats and the precious spices that could transform even simple ingredients, culinary delights. A pinch of cinnamon or cloves worth more than a peasant's annual income could elevate a dish from mere sustenance to genuine pleasure. The psychological toll of this constant food insecurity cannot be overstated. The knowledge that one's next meal was that permeated every aspect of life never guaranteed that a failed harvest or a clan raid could mean starvation. Had to watch helplessly as malnutrition and making the most of limited resources created a perpetual state of anxiety. Hardship the human spirit endured. Parents went to bed hungry so their children could eat, and even then often stunted their offspring's growth and left them vulnerable to disease. Yet even in the face of such, with neighbors helping neighbors through the worst times and celebrating together when fortune smiled, peasant women like Margaret Mallowd developed remarkable ingenuity. They learned to identify edible wild plants to preserve what little meat came their way through salting and smoking, and to stretch meager supplies through careful rationing and creative cooking. Community bonds were strengthened by shared adversity upon them. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life provided some structure and hope amid the uncertainty. The arrival of spring brought the promise of new growth, while harvest time offered the possibility of abundance, however temporary. Even the humblest peasant could take pride in a well-tended garden, or a successful batch of ale, finding moments of satisfaction in work well done, despite the harsh circumstances. As we reflect on the struggles of medieval Scottish peasants like Hamish and Margaret Mallowd, we are reminded of how far humanity has progressed in securing basic necessities, the abundance and variety of food available today, the safety standards that protect us from contamination, and the social systems. When a full belly was a luxury and hunger was a constant, the face of seemingly insurmountable that provides support in times of need, all these represent centuries of gradual improvement from those dark days, who despite having so little found ways to create meaning, companion their story, serves as both a sobering reminder of the hardships our ancestors endured, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in challenges in their daily struggles for survival. We see reflected the fundamental dignity of ordinary people, community, and hope in their lives. Looking at your script summary and the of medieval life unfold before us from the brutal justice system reference materials, I'll continue from where you left off, focusing on the social divides and legal structures that shaped medieval European society. Here's part 6. As we've witnessed the harsh realities to the constant struggle for sustenance, we begin to see how these hardships carved deep divisions into the very fabric of society. The strange laws we've explored were not merely quirks of a bygone era, but tools. Their days were filled with courtly pursuits, elaborate ceremonies that reinforced a rigid hierarchy where one's birth determined one's fate with merciless precision. Picture, if you will, a world where the accident of your birth could sentence you to a lifetime of backbreaking labor, enjoyed lives of leisure and abundance simply because they emerged from the right womb. This was the reality of medieval Europe, where society was stratified into 3 distinct orders, each as separate as oil and water, yet bound together by invisible chains of obligation and dependence. At the pinnacle of this pyramid sat the nobility. Those who fought and ruled these were the lords and ladies, who lived in stone castles that pierced the sky like monuments to power and the intricate dance of politics. They wore silk and velvet, dined on exotic delicacies, and spoke in refined tongues that marked them as clearly as any coat of arms for them. The strange laws we've encountered, tools of control, weapons to be wielded against those beneath them, below them, yet still elevated above. The masses stood the clergy, those who prayed. These men and women of God possessed a rather than Bodhi's different kind of power, one that claimed dominion over souls. They lived in monasteries and cathedrals, surrounded by illuminated manuscripts and sacred relics. Their influence stretched into every corner of life, from the bedroom to the marketplace, dictating not just what people believed, but how of the entire edifice on their bent backs toiled the peasantry, those who worked these where they lived, ate and even thought. And at the base of this structure, supporting the weight, the vast majority of Europe's population, bound to the land like trees rooted in soil, unable to move or change their station without permission from their betters. They lived in vales of mud and thatch, their hands perpetually stained with dirt, their backs permanently curved from endless labor. The legal system we've explored served to maintain the divisions with ruthless efficiency. The very concept of justice itself was different depending on which rung of the ladder you occupied. A noble who killed a peasant might pay a fine, while a peasant who stole bread could face the gallows. The trial by combat that seemed so it was not witnesses or physical proof that would determine guilt or innocence. Instead, the 2 men, absurd to our modern eyes, made perfect sense. In a world where physical prowess was seen as a divine gift, God was believed to favor the righteous with strength. And consider the tale of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a minor lord who found himself accused of murder by a peasant, so skilled with plough and scythe, fumbled with the unfamiliar way. Willem, the accusation was serious, the evidence compelling, yet when the matter came of packed earth, armed with sword and shield, while before the court he had worked all his life, they faced each other in a circle. Nobles and commoners alike gathered to watch divine justice unfold. Willem, though strong from years of farm labor, had never held a sword in anger. His that callous hands, order that benefited the few at the expense of steel. Sir Geoffrey, trained from childhood in the arts of war, moved with the fluid grace of a born killer. The outcome was never truly in doubt, when what each class could wear, ensuring that a glance was served as constant reminders. Villain fell, his blood seeping into the earth. Crowd nodded in satisfaction. God had spoken, justice had been served. But this was justice only in the eyes of those who crafted the system. To the peasants, watching their champion die was yet another reminder of their powerlessness. Another demonstration between classes was not just difficult, it was forbidden. The very food people ate was the law, existed not to protect them but to keep them in their place. The strange laws of medieval Europe were not bugs in the system. They were features carefully designed to preserve a social many. This rigid hierarchy extended beyond the courtroom into every aspect of daily life. Sanctuary laws dictated enough to determine someone's social status. A peasant caught wearing silk could be publicly whipped, while a merchant who dared to don the colors of nobility might find himself stripped of his wealth and status. These laws, though crossing the boundaries, regulated by their station, while nobles feasted on exotic spices that cost more than a peasant's annual income, the common folk were often forbidden from hunting the game that roamed freely through their fields. Poaching a deer from the Lord's forest was not just theft, it was an assault on the natural order itself, punishable by death or mutilation. The irony was bitter. These animals might destroy a peasant's crops, leaving as he could not touch them without risking his life, family to face starvation. Yet marriage too was subject to the whims of the social hierarchy. Peasants could not marry without their lord's permission, and that permission often came with a price: the right to choose one's own spouse. Something we consider fundamental was a luxury reserved for those with wealth and status. Young women might find themselves wed to strangers, their bodies and futures traded like commodities in deals that served their family's interests, but ignored their own desires. Their souls speeded to heaven by paid prayers and costly masses. The poor was often the only comfort available to the suffering masses. Even this final to the afterlife dependent on the charity of others. Even death could not escape the grasp of social distinction. The wealthy were buried in elaborate tombs, within consecrated ground, dumped into unmarked graves. Their passage, while village priests struggled to maintain their authority over congregations who, in a world where the promise of heaven hope was rationed according to one's ability to pay the church, despite its teachings of equality, God was deeply complicit in maintaining these divisions. While Christ had preached that the meek would inherit the earth, his earthly representatives seemed more interested and ordained in ensuring that the meek remained meek. Bishops lived like princes. Their palaces, rivaling those of secular lords, often knew as much scripture as they did. The doctrine of the three orders was not merely a social convenience, it was presented as divine will. Peasants were told that their suffering, by which a small elite maintained control over the vast law and justice, was part of God's plan, that their earthly toil would be rewarded in heaven. Rather, but only if they accepted their fate without complaint. Those who questioned this arrangement were not just rebels of justice to grind the powerless beneath their heels. As we drift deeper into the realm of they were heretics, challenging the very structure that God himself. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly stable system, tensions simmered like water in a kettle. The same laws that maintained order also created the conditions for explosive rebellion. How easily we might find ourselves walking similar paths if, when people have nothing left to lose, when the law offers no protection and no hope for improvement, when justice becomes a mockery and mercy a foreign concept, desperation can transform the best souls into revolutionaries. Perhaps we will carry with us a deeper appreciation for the rights and freedoms that countless the strange laws of medieval Europe were not just historical curiosities, they were the instruments of oppression, the tools majority of the population. They remind us that we better understand the fragility of the justice we too often take for granted in the morning light, and terrible laws that once held our ancestors in chains as the golden hour that all that each generation must earn anew, but rather that defined every aspect of not the same thing that legal systems can be crafted to serve power, but its reminder that then truth, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who, the true strangeness of, would use the machinery sleep. Let the medieval shadows remind us of how far we have traveled from of the church wielding both those dark days, yet that was both absolute and arbitrary. We forget the lessons written in the blood and tears of our ancestors. The strange laws of medieval Europe were not accidents of history, they were deliberate choices, and in understanding were the manor courts, where local lords held sway over their peasants with consciousness returns. Generations fought and died to secure for in the end. Medieval law was not its brutality or its absurdity. Justice is not a given, it is a gift. Rest now and let the whispers of history carry you toward dreams, where the scales of justice are balanced by the weight of gold or the strength of arms, but by the simple recognition souls, regardless of birth or station, deserve dignity, compassion, and the chance to live free from the strange light filters through the barred windows of a medieval manor house. Casting long shadows across the cold stone floors, we find ourselves transported to a world where justice was not blind, deeply entrenched in the rigid social hierarchy. Life tonight we continue our gentle journey through the peculiar and often harsh legal landscape of medieval Europe, where the law served not as an equalizer, but as a powerful tool to maintain the vast chasm between the noble and the common. The medieval legal system was a complex web of overlapping jurisdictions and competing authorities, each with their own interpretation of justice. At the highest level sat the king's courts dispensing royal justice with ceremonies that bordered on the theatrical. Below them operated the ecclesiastical courts, spiritual and temporal power over matters of morality and faith. Scattered throughout the countryside authority, but perhaps nowhere was the inequality of medieval justice more apparent. In the concept of Vergeld, the ancient Germanic practice of assigning monetary values to human lives based on social status. Under this system, the life of a nobleman might be worth 30 times that of a common peasant. And these valuations were not merely symbolic but formed the basis for, in cases of murder or injury, a lord who killed a serf might pay a few legal compensation, silver coins to the victim's family, while a peasant who dared raise a hand against nobility faced execution without question. The courts themselves reflected this stark social divide in their very architecture and procedure. When a nobleman appeared before a judge, he was of elaborate ceremony, comfortable seating, and the presumption of honesty that came with his elevated station. His word carried weight simply by virtue of his birth and proper legal form, and his testimony. The same tribunal these unfortunate souls was rarely questioned unless contradicted by someone of equal or higher rank. The proceedings moved at a dignified pace, with careful attention paid to precedent. How different was the experience for a common peasant dragged before herded into drafty, uncomfortable spaces, forced to stand throughout lengthy the support of their betters, to carry any proceedings that they often could not understand due to the use of Latin or French legal terminology. Their own testimony was viewed with suspicion, requiring multiple witnesses or credibility. The very clothes they wore marked them as inferior, their rough, homespun garments, a stark contrast to the fine silks and furs of their social superiors. Was convicted of a crime, he might face exile, the loss. However, punishment was not only physical. The punishments meted out by these courts further reinforced the social order through their deliberate upon the survivor inequality. When a nobleman of lands, or at worst a swift execution by sword or death, considered honorable of more elaborate execution methods and befitting his station, the wealthy could often purchase pardons or commute, and publicly humiliating the stocks and pillory were favorite as to determine guilt or innocence. Their sentences through substantial payments to the crown, transforming justice into yet another commodity, available only to those with means. For the common people, designed to be both severe devices for minor infractions, forcing the guilty to endure discomfort, but the jeers and abuse of their neighbors, more serious crimes for a prescribed distance, usually 9 steps before having their hands brought, flogging, branding, or the loss of limbs, punishments that left permanent marks of shame. The gallows were reserved for the most heinous offenses. But even here class distinctions persisted. While nobles granted the mercy of a quick death, commoners often faced the bottom again, the condition of their flesh. After slow strangulation of hanging or the prolonged agony, the legal proceedings themselves were often elaborate performances designed as much to reinforce social hierarchy. Trial by ordeal remained a common practice well into the medieval period, based on the belief that divine denominate champions to undergo the trial. Intervention would protect the innocent from harm. These orals took many forms, each more terrifying than the last. For those forced to endure them, the ordeal of hot iron required that these orals were not accused to carry a piece of red hot metal. Heresy and witchcraft, with a zeal that often bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wound showed signs of healing, they were declared innocent. If infection had set in, guilt was assumed. The ordeal and torture that were refined to extract confessions from even the most innocent. Defendants of boiling water demanded that the accused plunge their hand into a cauldron of bubbling liquid to retrieve a stone or ring from 3 days, would determine their fate. Most chilling was the ordeal of cold water, where the accused was bound and thrown into a pond or river sank. They were considered innocent, often drowned in the process. If they floated, it was taken as proof that the water as God's creation had rejected them, confirming their guilt and condemning them to death. The cruel irony was that survival itself became evidence of wrongdoing, applied equally across society. Nobles and clergy could often avoid them entirely through their connections and influence, or substitute monetary payments in their place. When members of the upper classes were subjected to orals, they were frequently allowed on their behalf, while peasants had no such luxury and faced these terrifying tests with their own flesh and blood. The church played a particularly complex role in medieval justice. Simultaneously, offering sanctuary to some while condemning others to horrific fates. Ecclesiastical courts handled matters of moral transgression bordered on the fanatical. Inquisition, that most dreaded of church institutions, wielded techniques of interrogation. Women, particularly those of lower social standing, were especially vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. A widow with property that neighbors coveted, a healer whose remedies seemed too effective, or simply an elderly woman with an sharp tongue might find herself dragged before church authorities on charges of consorting with devils. The trials that followed were elaborate theater designed to confirm predetermined guilt rather than seek an impossible situation. If she confessed immediately, truth, the accused which faced confirmed her guilt and faced burning at the stake. Her innocence, she was subjected to increasingly severe torture, until pain forced her to admit to crimes she had never committed. The methods employed were both ingenious and horrifying. The strappado, which dislocated shoulders and arms, the rack or moles that any person might possess, which stretched bodies until joints separated, and the thumbscrews which crushed fingers with excruciating precision. Even the search for evidence of witchcraft reflected the biases of the age, the famous deviless marks that inquisitors sought on accused women's bodies were often nothing more than birthmark scars. Yet when found on a wealthy merchant's wife, such marks might be dismissed as natural imperfections. Blemishes on a peasant woman became irrefutable proof of supernatural corruption. The treatment of accused witches during imprisonment further demonstrated the class-based nature of medieval justice. Noblewomen accused of sorcery were often confined in relative comfort, provided with adequate food and clothing. Where they faced deliberate deprivation designed to weaken their resistance, they were stripped of their acknowledged that all were described in euphemistic terms. While awaiting trial, they might receive visits from family members and spiritual advisors, and their interrogations proceeded with at least the pretense of legal procedure. Women, however, were thrown into dank dungeons, clothing, and forced to endure cold, hunger, and the constant threat of sexual assault by their jailers. The psychological torture of isolation and challenger of divine order, uncertainty, was often as effective as any physical abuse in breaking down their defenses. The very language used in legal proceedings reinforced social hierarchies in subtle but powerful ways, virtually unknown for when nobles appeared in court, addressed with elaborate titles and honorifics that emphasized their elevated, while wealthy defendants could employ learned status, their crimes that minimized their severity. A nobleman who murdered a peasant might be said to argue their cases and navigate the complexities of legal procedure. Peasants faced the intimidating, have acted in righteous anger, or to have corrected an insolent servant language that transformed cold-blooded killing into acceptable social discipline. Peasants, by contrast, found their actions described in the harshest possible terms. A hungry farmer who poached a rabbit from his lord's forest became a thief and violator of sacred property. A woman, their own guilt through ignorance of proper legal responses that cast doubt on their records further advantaged the wealthy while disadvantaging the poor who spoke harshly to her betters, was transformed into a disturber of the peace. This linguistic manipulation served to justify the severe punishments that inevitably followed. Penalties seemed not only appropriate but necessary for the preservation of social stability. The concept of legal representation, so fundamental to our modern understanding of justice, was common people of medieval Europe advocates machinery of justice entirely alone. They were expected to understand Latin legal terminology, comprehend arcane procedural requirements, and present in no means to prove their traditional rights coherent defenses, despite having no education or training in such matters. A peasant family that had worked the same land for and customary rates, a wealthy that made such this disparity in legal resources often determined outcomes before trials even were so commonplace that a skilled advocate could find procedural grounds to dismiss charges, locate witnesses to provide alibis, or present alternative interpretations of evidence. Client's guilt. The unrepresented defendant meanwhile stumbled through proceedings they could barely comprehend, often inadvertently confirming the keeping of legal. Nobles maintained extensive documentation of their rights, properties, and legal precedents, creating paper trails that could support their claims in court. They employed scribes and clerks to ensure that favorable judgments were properly recorded and preserved for future reference. These documents became powerful weapons in legal battles, providing evidence of ancient privileges and establishing patterns of precedent that favored their interests. Peasants, being largely illiterate and unable to afford scribal services, left little documentary evidence of their legal affairs. Their right were existed primarily in oral tradition and customary practice, making them vulnerable to challenges by those with written proof to support their claims. A nobleman with a properly documented deed could easily dispossess generations, leaving them with no recourse. The corruption that pervaded medieval legal systems was both systematic and openly acknowledged. Judges and court officials expected regular payments from those seeking favorable treatment, and these bribes they had acquired their own elaborate etiquette. Defendant could essentially purchase not only favorable verdicts, but also the procedural advantages, outcomes possible for the poor. However, even small bribes represented impossible expenses. A peasant family's entire annual income might not equal the cost of a minor court favor, leaving them entirely dependent on the supposed impartiality of officials who had long since abandoned any pretense of equal treatment. The result was a justice system that operated as a marketplace where legal outcomes were bought and sold like any other commodity. The physical conditions of medieval prisons reflected these same class distinctions with brutal clarity. Wealthy prisoners could purchase comfortable accommodations, adequate food, and even the services of personal servants. During their confinement, they might occupy private chambers with windows, furniture, and the freedom to receive visitors, however, and conduct business. Some noble prisoners lived better in jail than many free peasants did in their own homes. Common criminals were herded into overcrowded, disease-ridden dungeons where death from illness was more likely than eventual release. They received minimal food of the poorest quality, often crawling with vermin, and barely sufficient to sustain life. No medical care was provided for the sick or injured, and the strong preyed upon the weak in an environment extended even that minimized where guards turned blind eyes to violence among their charges. These disparities in treatment to the moment of execution, noble criminals who faced death were granted elaborate final ceremonies that they might be allowed final speeches, visits from clergy of therefore proper burial in consecrated ground common for their humanity. They were marched to honor their rank, even as their lives were forfeit, choosing and carried out with swift, merciful methods that where influence and gold could. Suffering, their bodies were often returned to their families. Criminals faced death as they had faced life, without dignity or consideration for the innocent, but as a tool for maintaining. To others, denied even the basic dignity of proper execution sites amid jeering crowds, denied final words or spiritual comfort, and killed by methods deliberately chosen for their cruelty and public spectacle. Their bodies were often left to rot on gibbets. Burial. As we drift deeper into the realm of sleep, let us reflect on this complex tapestry of medieval justice, where law served not as a protection, the rigid social order that defined every aspect of existence in this world. Birth determined not only one's station in life, but also the very nature of justice one could expect to receive. Wealthy lived in a realm where law was malleable, reshaped reality itself, and transformed the guilty into the innocent. They enjoyed the protection of elaborate procedures, skilled advocates, and sympathetic judges who understood that true justice meant preserving the natural order that placed them at society's apex. The poor, meanwhile,